For 3 weeks now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has dominated headlines. How Ukraine is resisting the Russian aggression, how civilians have taken up arms to defend their country, and how Europe is facing its biggest security crisis since the Cold War. The current conflict in Ukraine has multiple layers, fueled by multiple issues. But at the crux of this conflict is one belief. Russia believes that it was betrayed by the West, that the West broke promises made at the end of the Cold War. The promise in question is that the NATO would not expand to the east. The Russian president has long argued that the US broke a promise that it made in 1990. While there are different interpretations on what was promised to Russian leader Gorbachev then, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has long looked at it as betrayal. Let's pull out a map now to explain why he thinks so. Here's a map of Europe. The countries marked in yellow are the ones that joined NATO before 1997. This includes the likes of Norway, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and others. But here's a look at the countries marked in orange. These are the nations that joined the military alliance after 1997, including several Central and East European states that were once a part of the Soviet Union or under its sphere of influence. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, 4 of them even have borders with Russia. But the fact is, Ukraine could be paying the price for NATO's gambles. NATO's first such gamble was expanding eastwards. Before 1991, NATO was confined to Western Europe. Today, it is at Russia's gates. If Ukraine joins the NATO, the alliance will be at Russia's gates. But the point is, Ukraine was satisfied with its position a decade ago. It did not want to join the alliance. But the annexation of Crimea in 2014 has changed that. It left Ukraine worried. It wants to ensure its security, and joining NATO seems like the best option. NATO's second big miscalculation was the belief that Russia was bluffing. NATO refused to negotiate an agreement on Ukrainian neutrality. It hoped that Russia would back down, but that backfired majorly. Russia invaded Ukraine and NATO was nowhere to be seen. Even all the NATO ambitions that Ukraine had seem to have fizzled as of now. Even Volodymyr Zelensky seems to have admitted it.
Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and we understand that. We are adequate people. We have heard for years that the doors were open, but we also heard that we could not join. It's the truth, and it must be recognized. I'm glad that our people are beginning to understand this and rely on themselves and our partners who help us.
So if the point was a neutral status, this could have been negotiated ahead of the war. If NATO knew that its doors were closed for Ukraine, why did it continue to talk about membership? And we are not the only ones saying this. Even the foreign policy chief of the European Union agrees. Josep Borrell says the West made a mistake by offering NATO membership to Ukraine. I'm quoting from his statement. There are things that we proposed and then could not implement, such as the promise that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. I think it's a mistake to make promises you cannot deliver. Don't make promises that you cannot deliver. That's the clear message for NATO right now. Over the last 3 weeks, NATO has pledged support for Ukraine, but directly the alliance has done absolutely nothing. Member countries have individually sent weapons, but calls for a no-fly zone or direct involvement were a complete no-no. A no-fly zone would essentially mean that NATO planes would have to shoot down Russian jets, which would mean that the NATO would be a direct part of this conflict. The fact is, NATO does not want to get involved, and this is not the first time that it has said this. Time and again, NATO, the West, making it clear they are not a part of this war. The war in Ukraine is now 3 weeks old. There is no doubt about the fact that this is Putin's war. But to believe that the US and NATO are innocent bystanders is a myth. With no hope left for membership, Ukraine could be paying the price for NATO's gambles. Let's go straight across now to Fred Weir, who's with us on the broadcast from Moscow. Thanks very much for joining us. To what extent do you think the West underestimated Vladimir Putin? What could it have done differently?
You know, I think you gave a very, very good summary of how we got here just now. There's a tremendous amount of blame to go around. And, of course, you made the point that this is Vladimir Putin's war. Whatever hand of cards he held until February 4th, it was a very strong case against NATO expansion for diplomacy and a new security order in Europe. Those were all arguments that were really strong. He threw that away and invaded Ukraine, and this is all on him now. This is out of all proportion. But when this ends, and it will end, however it ends, we need to return to that discussion. Russia was, all of its paranoid buttons were pushed in the last 30 years. Promises were broken. You know, if you go to George Washington University's archives, they're all online. You see the promises that were made to Gorbachev. There were no treaties signed, but in meeting after meeting with Western leaders, including James Baker, the Secretary of State, the promise was made to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch further. The Russians have a very good case about that. Now, there's no point in discussing it now. We're doing that, but the time will come when we have to return to that if things are ever to be normalized again.
Sanctions are clearly not stopping the Russian president. He has issued his own tit-for-tat sanctions against the U.S. What more can the West do at this point, according to you?
Well, if they don't want World War III, and they don't want World War III, something like a no-fly zone, which would put Russian and NATO forces into direct collision, would mean war. And Russian nuclear doctrine is really clear. They're already have their nuclear forces on alert, and if they start to lose a conventional war, they will transform to nuclear weaponry, and that's the end of Europe as and possibly the world as we knew it, or at all. So let's hope that instead of ratcheting this thing up, you know, there's a tremendous amount of talk in the West, in the United States, quite a few hawkish people talking about fighting to the last Ukrainian. And yet they are not ready, let's hope, not ready to step in and fight for Ukraine. And that's good. But what they're also not doing in the West is stepping up and promoting a diplomatic solution, because it's still available. Other countries, Israel, Turkey, are stepping into the void. They're making real progress. And if you listen to both sides, Ukrainian and Russian, there is the outlines of a deal, including neutrality for Ukraine. Zelensky has made it clear that, okay, we can do that. There are other issues, including the annexation of Crimea and recognition of the Donbass republics. But basically, it's about neutrality, always has been, could have been resolved before. That's not to absolve Putin of anything, but it's still a possible way out of this.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.